This is the manometer and gauge display we built. Just like to first off, before we start it up, we're just going to ensure that we are wearing all of our safety PPE, proper gloves, eye protection, ear protection when wearing the pump, running the pump. We acquired these gauge from Paramount Supply in Bellingham, Washington. They were nice enough to donate these gauges to us. So before we fire up this display, we're going to ensure that obviously we're wearing all of our PPE, but now we're going to ensure that all the valves are shut off before we pressurize the system. As you can see, valves 1 through 5 are closed, and we will now go to the... So we'll begin by turning the supply valve in the on position. We will then adjust the pressure adjustment up to approximately 20 psi. We're not going to be using more than 5.5 psi for this, so 20 is more than enough. There we go. Once we've turned on the air supply, the air now is traveling down this hose and hitting our first regulator. As you can see, it's coming in at approximately 20 psi. After it hits this, it Y's off and it goes to our display. Oops, that's okay. So it comes down this line here, comes to this T, travels up this copper tubing, and then hits our shutoff valve, or valve 1. At this point, we will now turn on the digital pressure gauge. The digital pressure gauge is turned on. We will adjust the adjusting screw and set it to 0 psi. We will now introduce the pressurized air into the system. So once we have introduced the air, we're going to now set it to 3 psi, and I'll slowly rotate the adjusting screw clockwise, and as you can see, it's now reading about 2.5 psi. We're going to get that to about 3 psi, as close as we can. So there we go. We'll now set the locking nut in place, so we don't have an increase of pressure any more than that, because we don't want our manometer to overfill. So now we will continue down this copper tubing. It comes to a T. We want to run our PSI A gauge and our compound gauge, PSI G. So we'll now slowly open valve number 3, and we'll slowly open valve number 4. As you can see, you can compare the difference. Essentially, the PSI-A gauge is 14.7 psi more than the PSI-G gauge. We can now open valve number 5 to display the manometer and its readings. So now we're ready to open valve number 5, which is the manometer. As you can see, the liquid is at roughly level. But once when I pressurize the system, air is going to enter the tubes, and it's going to therefore push and separate the mixture inside. So here I'll go, slowly open it, and see if you can follow the... It goes pretty fast. So now it's down there at 19 inches, and the other end, the other side of the water is all the way up at about 96. The water will travel approximately 27 inches per psi. As you can see now, we have our system fully pressurized at approximately 3 psi. The one gauge we have, however, is locked out would be the atmospheric gauge. It's locked out because right now, if it was pressurized, the needle would be off the scale and potentially harm the gauge. So for safety reasons for the gauge, we have it locked out. when we go into vacuum mode, we will unlock it and display these 2 gauges, these 3 gauges, and the manometer. Okay, so now we're going to max out 2 of our gauges, or apply as much pressure as the gauges will take on the the compound gauge, PSI G and inches of mercury, and over here on our PSIA gauge. So basically we're going to isolate the manometer and isolate the atmospheric gauge. So we have this valve here closed, ensuring that the air won't back into the vacuum regulator. We have our atmospheric gauge locked out to ensure that it won't receive any air. And our valve number 5 is going to be closed as well, ensuring that we're not placing positive air on the manometer. So here we go. So we have our first regulator set at approximately 20 psi. We're going to go ahead and open up valve number 1 in the on position. We'll open up valve 3 and valve 4. Right now we're not reading any pressure into the system after the regulator, so we're going to slowly open this by rotating the set screw. And while we're doing this, we're watching the gauges down below, ensuring that we're not going to go over the 30 psia. So we're going to see how far we can take this and compare the 2 gauges. So right now we're at about 9 psi. So we're getting pretty close on the PSIA gauge, about 20 psia, 28.
Should be at 15.3.
So we're gonna stop here. Approximately 15 psi coming into our digital PSIG gauge, and we'll come down here and we're gonna compare our readings and take our recordings at that time. So now we will begin our shutdown procedures. We're going to come back here. We're going to decrease our pressure coming into the system to 0. We're going to do this slowly just for this demonstration, mainly because the manometer, if you reduce the pressure too quickly, it'll create numerous air bubbles in the system. So we're just going to slowly reduce the air pressure while looking at the liquid in the manometer, ensuring that we're not creating air bubbles. Maybe you can stand up there and watch it slowly come down. It's mainly as it drops down slowly. I'm just ensuring that it's not creating any air bubbles within the system. So just kind of slowly work it down. And again, if it does create an air bubble, you can pressurize it shortly and kind of grabs the air bubbles and go back to lowering it. So we're almost at 0 psi, and there we go. So now that we've got this zeroed out, we can then come down and close valve number 3 and valve number 4, and then we'll come over to valve number 1, which is our main shutoff for this display, and close that. As we follow the line back down, we're going to come over here to the main supply air, and we'll put that in the off position and decrease the pressure adjustment. Thus, we're just basically repeating the steps. So now we'll begin to run through the startup operations with our vacuum pump. We're going to display negative pressure throughout the system. As you already saw, we displayed positive pressure, but now we're going to run the vacuum pump and compare negative pressure. So first, before firing the pump up, we're going to want to take a peek down here and ensure that there is proper amount of oil. As you can see, it's approximately halfway filled up, which is good. Next, we're going to come to the vacuum regulator. This is the really important part with the manometer. Before firing up at all, we want to ensure it's in the off position, and we want to ensure that the adjustment is fully closed, and you'll hear a click. So we know that this is completely turned off. So when we fire up the pump, basically it's not going to have an instant surge of vacuum pressure to the manometer. If it does do that, the issue we'll have basically is we're going to suck this fluid all the way through the tubing. It's going to come down here, and it's actually going to mix with our oil. That's saying that basically our vacuum pressure was too high, and it sucked all the way through our system. So we're going to avoid that as much as possible. Next, we're going to come over here and ensure, again, all of our valves are shut off. As you can see, this is our atmospheric gauge. It's locked out currently, but now we'll be able to operate it. So we want to get the key. You can acquire the key from the instructor, and we'll now unlock it and get it ready for operation. And it's just a sleeve that slides off like so, and now the valve's exposed to turn it for operation. So now that we've verified all the valves are closed and valve number 2 is ready in operation, we will begin to plug in our vacuum pump located down here on the right hand side. And again, before we continue or start this up, we want to ensure, once again, proper PPE, eyes. Now that we're going to be operating a pump, I'd suggest wearing earplugs. Even though the decibels aren't that loud, it's still always good to protect your ears. So then once we have that in place, we'll come around, and there's an inline switch. This turns the pump on. So we're going to fire up the pump. So once when we're ready to apply vacuum to the system, we will turn the white knob into the regular position, also known as on, and we will come up top to valve 5, and we will turn it in the on position along with our other gauges. Our PSIA gauge we will turn on, our compound gauge, PSIG and inches of mercury we will turn on, and then our atmospheric gauge, we will turn that on. We will now walk back over to our vacuum regulator and slowly rotate the adjustment clockwise. And as we do this, we will see our millimeters of mercury gauge increase. So I'm turning this once again clockwise, and now we're beginning to see a vacuum applied to the manometer. And as I slowly turn it, the water in the system rises. We will now walk down our line and compare our readings. As you can see here, we have 0.8 atmospheric pressure. Down here on the compound gauge, we're reading approximately 6 inches of mercury. And here we're reading approximately 11.5 PSIA. This is a great display to show all the variations and different readings across the board. There will also be a diagram for you. Basically, it's a conversion chart to show the mathematical formulas to convert each one and to ensure that the gauges are reading accurately. So again, we're going to be showing max vacuum on the system. So with that, we're going to want to shut off valve number 5 to ensure that we do not suck any of the liquid out of the manometer into the pump. This is very important. So when you want to run these gauges and max vacuum, ensure that valve number 5 is off so you don't suck any fluid into the pump. We will now come down here and open up valve number 4, valve number 3, and valve number 2. We will then come back over to the vacuum regulator and put it in regular mode or on position and slowly rotate the adjustment clockwise while looking at the 3 gauges on the manifold. As you can see, the needles have begun to move. I'm going to slowly continue to open or rotate that adjustment clockwise while ensuring that the needles or the gauges do not get maxed out. We want to make sure that we're not going to damage the gauges in any way. So now we have the vacuum regulator at full capacity. We will now go down and take readings on each gauge. This vacuum pump, thankfully it cannot max out the gauges, so they are protected in that manner. So now that we've operated the system in vacuum mode and gained all of our readings, we will now begin shutdown operation. We will first begin, we will go to the vacuum regulator. We will slowly decrease the vacuum in the system, just like the pressure. We want to do this slowly, essentially to ensure that the manometer will not gain any air bubbles within the system. So I'm going to slowly decrease the vacuum on the manometer while looking up top, ensuring that I'm not creating any bubbles within the line. And again, if you do it too quickly, there's a possibility that will create bubbles, and you'll just have to increase the pressure and start over and slowly lower it. Oh, vacuum. Wait till it's like, where are you at? 69? So as you can see, the pressure is slowly and here's an example of if you do it too fast, what will happen. Now let me do it again. It's kind of hard to see. You might have to stand up there. So there's an example. I went a little too quick decreasing the vacuum on the system, and therefore you can see I created an air bubble around the 74-inch mark and down here at the 60-inch mark. So in order to get these out, we're going to apply vacuum once again until all the water in the system has met up, and then once again slowly decreasing the vacuum upon the manometer. And while I'm doing this, I'm also looking at the other gauges, ensuring that the needles are moving and in full operation. Okay, now we're set back to where we were. There's no vacuum being applied on the system. We will come back down here to our vacuum regulator switch and turn it in the off position. We will come over here to valve 5 and close valve 5, valve 4, valve 3, and valve 2. We're now ready to turn off the pump. So again, we'll go to the inline switch, turn that in the off position. We will then restore the pump back in original state by unplugging the power source. and repeating the steps of locking valve number 2 out. So again, here's the device that we use. It's from North. Essentially, it's just a sleeve that locks the valve into place. We take our padlock, we'll go to the first slot. And now valve 2 is locked out.